Thrawn has always been a prominent character within the lore of Star Wars, both in and out of universe, but his home polity, the Chiss Ascendancy, is a bit more obscure and mysterious. The faction was a kind of oligarchy governed by a group of ruling families. So today we're going to talk about the Chiss ruling families we know about in both the Legends and canon continuities. A lot of the information on how the Chiss government as a whole, and ruling families in particular, works in Legends, comes directly from Thrawn in the Outbound Flight novel, as well as some extra information from Survivor's Quest, also by Timothy Zahn, and the Dark Nest trilogy by Troy Denning. In canon, they were primarily explored by Timothy Zahn in the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. There's a lot of overlap in overall function between Legends and canon, although the specifics of individual families got changed. It even changes a little bit between Zahn's own Legends and canon works, so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Outbound Flight and the Ascendancy trilogy, each set around 10 years before the Clone Wars, established that there are 9 ruling families, so that's true in both the Legends and canon continuities at that point. This wasn't a fixed number throughout history, though. Sometimes families could gain prominence and join the ranks of the major ruling families. Other times, through political, economic, or even military factors, a family could drop out of the ruling family group or be wiped out entirely, although that was a bit more rare. While the ruling families were the major points of power within Chiss politics, there was also a semi-democratic parliament in Legends, representing all 5 trillion Chiss from Chilla and all the 28 other colonies. This parliament included appointed governors from some colonies as well as members from the ruling families directly. Taking into account that a lot of these positions were appointed and chosen by the ruling families directly, and there's definitely an elitist and reserved nature to Chiss politics, it's unclear just how much say any individual Chiss had in their representation at any point. Some sources just refer to a council of families operating around kind of similar lines, so it's likely these were intended to be the same body, or at least would have been retconned as such had anyone bothered to worry about that while doing any kind of sourcebook. On the canon side, though, there's instead the Syndicure and the Aristocrat, which fill a similar role to the Council of Families or the Parliament. The big difference is that where Legends focuses on just the ruling families, in canon the ruling families are joined by other families among what were known as the 40 Great Families. But let's move on to the ruling families as they existed in Legends. Despite the name, the ruling families were not families in a strictly biological sense. The in-universe University of Sanbra of the Legends continuity does mention them as being ancient bloodlines, but the families would often adopt in new members, and given Chiss social mores, would likely cast out even blood relatives as well for a flagrant enough violation, and we see this adoption process with Thrawn and his brother Thras. They get taken into the Myth family, becoming what were known as merit adoptives. And while Thrawn in particular had shown a lot of aptitudes that made him a kind of hot commodity among the families, this seems to be what would commonly happen for anyone trying to make their way up through Chiss society. In Legends especially, every Chiss in the Ascendancy claims some kind of association with one of the ruling families, depending on their areas of jurisdiction and whether they like this video and subscribe for more. It was established that each family controlled certain elements of policy, though as we've noted, the number of ruling families can and does vary throughout history, meaning their purposes likely change as well, with Thrawn saying the number has been as high as 12 ruling families and as low as 3 at any given time. And even though we know there are 9 families in Legends in Outbound Flight, we don't know the names of all of those families. Later on, when the Chiss began to re-emerge in the galaxy between the actions of the Empire of the Hand, Thrawn's secret Unknown Regions Empire, the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, and especially the Dark Nest crisis of 35 ABY, there are only 4 ruling families, having dropped 5 in the space of about half a century. That particular change in the number of ruling families actually happened as the result of a civil war over the use of bug labor, which I've covered in another video. The 4 remaining families are mentioned as being the Naruto family of Naparar, the Chapla family of Seoral, the Inrokini family from Chaos, and the Sabosin family from Sposia. Notably, Thrawn and Thras's adoptive family, the Myths, seem to have lost their position. Also notably, the Naruto family is only mentioned by other authors, not Zahn, who treated only the first part of the Chiss's full name, i.e. the myth in Thrawn's name, Mithra Naruto, as a family name. This is therefore one of the areas of divergence between Zahn's family setup, both with how he handles it in Legends and canon, and the slightly messier setup that comes with the inclusion of other authors in Legends. It should be noted that the first introduction of the idea of the Chiss ruling families came from those other Legends authors in the New Jedi Order, and then it was Zahn that kind of changed some things going into Outbound Flight and Survivor's Quest. The Chapla family was primarily in charge of overall resource management in the colonies. The Naruto family was in charge of foreign affairs and the military, which often went hand in hand since the Chiss rarely interacted with others except to tell them to go away. In practice, this involved the management of both the Chiss Expansionary Defense Force and the colonial forces, with probably some oversight roles on the household phalanxes, which were essentially militias that belonged to different families. The Inrokini were in charge of other science and industry, and then the Sabozen family was in charge of primarily social programs, like health and education. The Chiss didn't have a formal currency, so social programs involving the distribution of resources were a very important factor in Chiss life. While we don't know exactly who the 9 families were in the time of Outbound Flight, we do technically get 9 family names in Legends as a whole. First is the Chaff family, the family of aristocrat Chaff Formbentrano, or Formby, a relatively major Chiss character, and a family which is confirmed to be one of the 9 at the time of Outbound Flight. Next is House Mierani, which was introduced in the Old Republic MMO, so it's not necessarily still around as one of the modern 9, but it is a possibility that it did last that long. Other modern families, not the sitcom, like the Myth and the Inrokini, were around in the time of the Old Republic as well, so there's no reason to think that the Mierani couldn't have made it that long. Outbound Flight also established that every CEDF member with a full name was a merit adoptive of a ruling family, so we can also extrapolate 2 other ruling family names from other characters in Zahn's books. There's Brast from Brastalship Barku, the captain of a vessel in Survivor's Quest, and Yal from Yalavikima, although since he's the chief engineer, it's possible that he's not counted under the warrior category. In canon, with the Ascendancy trilogy, which we'll move over to now, this seems to be expanded to being a merit adoptive of any of the 40 great families, not just the ruling families, so we can't do the same extrapolation there. The Ascendancy trilogy is packed with a bunch of Chiss lore, and it's all from one author, Timothy Zahn, so there's less we have to reconcile between different sources. Unlike Outbound Flight, which is implied to be at least semi-canon in its broad strokes by characters in the Ascendancy trilogy, the Ascendancy trilogy does name every ruling family of the day and then some, while also putting a sigil for each family on the artwork. Only 2 of the ruling families are shared with the Legends continuity here. The Myth family and the Chaff family stick around. On top of that, we have the Klar, Obik, Boadil, Pleek, Dasklo, Ufsa, and finally Aritzi. This series also more explicitly establishes that after a certain point, CEDF officers dropped family affiliation, hence Aralani not having a family name, even in her Outbound Flight introduction. Other legend sources tended to keep even very high-ranking Chiss officers with a family name, because a lot or even most of those books came out before Outbound Flight was actually written. Aralani's Ascendancy trilogy backstory established her as coming from the Aritzi family, making her original full name Aritzi Aralani. This series also did away with the one family, one responsibility setup of Legends, so each family had their own interests in a series of alliances, though they did tend to have some specialized reputations in different economic, political, or military skills or trades. This was more internal to how they operated, rather than being an official, family of the sciences within the ruling family setup. There's a lot more inter-family intrigue. Each of the families has their own house navies, so they definitely wouldn't have been okay with a situation where one family took charge of the entire CEDF, as well as all the colonial militias. Sometimes the conflicts between the houses almost led to full-on civil wars. But beyond the 9 current ruling families, we hear about a mix of other former ruling families and other members of the 40 great families. The original and formerly sole ruling family was the Stybla family, which still existed as a great family if not a ruling family, and was actually where Thrawn got the Odo part of the Naruto part of his name. This was done as an honorific in gratitude for services rendered to the Stybla family. There were additionally the Kaduyo and Zodlak families, both of whom had fairly recently lost ruling family status, and the latter of whom, the Zodlaks, were still especially salty about it. Beyond those three definitely former ruling families, we learn about some other great families who may or may not have been ruling families in the past. These are the Drok, Aragal, Pomrio, and Kiwu. If it feels like I'm throwing a lot of nonsense words at you, then congratulations, you're kind of getting the experience of reading this firsthand in the Ascendancy trilogy. I enjoyed the books and I liked how much depth we got on the Ascendancy, but there are a lot of names to learn, and they're quite long. That's going to do it for today though. I hope you've enjoyed the video, or at least learned some other places you can check if you want to learn more about the Chiss firsthand. Let me know what your favorite ruling family is in the comments. I think this is a kind of fun situation where the canon information and the legends information diverge, but where the canon information also shows a bit more of what the intent was from one of the legends authors, Timothy Zahn, while also highlighting some of the discrepancies within legends because Zahn kind of diverged from what the other authors were doing before him. Either way, thank you for watching, and special thanks to Marmar for editing this video.